representing a key international humanitarian agency, is engaged in many of these countries affected by stabilisation, for some initial thoughts before I open it up to the floor for questions and comments from all of you here.
Okay,
Vickie.
thank you, Sarah. So we've heard that stabilisation is expressed in different ways. It looks different in different places, and with that, a variety of challenges emerge, and of course that variety in challenges then also has different effects on NGOs depending on where they sit on the sliding scale of humanitarian to development. So what I'm going to try and do quickly for the purpose of the debate, to try and leave lots of times for question and answers, is to describe some of those challenges and perhaps introduce some thoughts from MSF's perspective on ways that the NGO community need to engage and reflect on the challenges. So I think the first is a challenge that has been alluded to in various of the presentations, and it affects all NGOs regardless of the nature of the work that we do. As stabilisation does not look the same everywhere, we do relate to stabilisations and militaries in different ways depending on the contexts. And that's because, of course, we all want to optimise the ability that we have to work in a set context to access people, and therefore we make decisions that are relevant locally. For example, in Haiti, following the earthquake, there are many organisations that did not consider it to be a problem to work alongside and in cooperation with the US military. Those very same organisations would make a very different decision in Afghanistan. But Sarah, in her opening presentation, referred to the globalised world that we all live in today. And as NGOs, what we cannot do is isolate our decisions from one country to the next. When NGOs arrived in Haiti following the earthquake, the world was watching to see if we would engage with the US military. And they watch how we work in Afghanistan. And it doesn't only go for the field level, we are watched in headquarters level as well, in capital. It matters how we engage in Kabul, in London, in Brussels, and in Washington. So we constantly have to balance this need to be effective locally with the ability to think globally. And I think that's a massive challenge for NGOs. We're not set up to do that way, and we're not used to it, and we're not really geared up to it. But also those things can work in direct contradiction to each other as well. So what may be effective locally, a partnership with an actor that is involved in stabilisation in some way, may not be very good for our global image, our reputation, and vice versa. So that's a real tension for NGOs, I think. Secondly, and this potentially affects those of us that are more geared towards the humanitarian end of the scale, we saw from Sarah's diagram that stabilisation, particularly at the sharp end, is accompanied by counterinsurgency and often counterterrorism. And as we've heard from Samir, that usually involves a lack of application of international humanitarian law. So that means there is an inability to recognise an armed group as a party to the conflict, as per the law of armed conflict. This labelling of opposition groups as terrorists, accompanied by the legislation, national and international, that criminalises contact with groups or the provision of material support, as we heard from Ken. Is really problematic for humanitarians because we rely on dialogue. We have to generate an understanding with the parties to the conflict of the humanitarian nature of our activities, and it is through this that we negotiate access. So when opposition groups are labelled terrorist and contact with them is criminalised, as is the case in Pakistan today, it becomes impossible for us to negotiate, and thus we run a very high risk of being instrumentalised by one party to the conflict. A third challenge that I would like to throw out for debate is that of speaking out, advocacy and communication. I mean, obviously MSF is known for being an outspoken organisation, but I think if you were to compare MSF today to how MSF was in the 90s, you would find that we are generally actually much quieter. And that is because we're much more aware today of the risks of our voice being manipulated. Of course, this isn't a new phenomenon. In the 90s, we were equally manipulated and used as propaganda to support the objectives of one side or another. But today, governments and armed groups are much more on top of our communication work than they ever have been before. We are asked to sign confidentiality clauses. Our websites are scanned as equally by the Taliban as they are by the Sri Lankan government. And if there is a DFID representative in the room today, I'm sorry to name and shame you, but for those who had the pleasure of being in a DFID meeting of Afghanistan a few weeks ago, governments ask NGOs for good news stories to counter the bad news stories that dominate in the media and thus win over public opinion. So for MSF, for whom testimony is a huge part of our raison d'etre, this is a massive challenge. A fourth challenge, and probably the biggest one of all, and that affects us all, regardless of where you sit on that sliding scale between humanitarian and development, is that stabilisation incorporates development as part of its way of working, as we can see from the diagram that was up. As we've heard, it's a transformative agenda. It's working to bring solutions to conflict-affected places, not just military solutions, but also in the form of governance, healthcare, education, etc. But at its heart, it's fundamentally political and driven by national security interests. And herein lies perhaps the biggest tension for NGOs and perhaps the most difficult of all decisions, in particular for those that combine a humanitarian and development remit. These shared characteristics with stabilisation may even open up the possibility for shared objectives. Let's be honest, the MDGs will never be met without some kind of progress in fragile states, something that's obviously central to DFID's decision-making at this very moment, even if it is definitely becoming clearer that for DFID, this concern is underpinned by national security rather than a commitment to the MDGs for their own sake. So then, how to work with that agenda that may bring, in the long term, better development outcomes, but at the same time is driven by a political imperative. And, certainly in those places where there is international conflict, clearly advances the interest of one party to the conflict over the other. How to do that in a way that doesn't fundamentally compromise the humanitarian part of your identity. From MSF's perspective, in those environments where development activities do clearly work to the benefit of one party to the conflict, it is simply not possible to do both. And to quote a Save the Children recent report, so not out of MSF, choices have to be made. And just to be really clear, there is nothing wrong with those choices, but all of them are legitimate, but they have to be clearly and transparently made. As MSF is a medical organisation, I just want to save my final words for the impact of this on healthcare and talk about an example which I think graphically illustrates the consequences of an activity which, under the rules of IHL, would be deemed humanitarian, but within stabilisation discourse, provides utility. So when MSF arrived back in Afghanistan and went to Helmand to work in Goodh Hospital in Lashkargah, Goodh was a key focus for stabilisation activities, and this with the specific aim of bringing legitimacy to the Afghan authorities. It had been renovated. There was all sorts of fancy equipment sitting in the basement, by the way, donated by various governments. But the hospital was virtually empty of patients. And this was because there was a large number of armed men present on the premises, both Afghan and international security forces. And as a result, the people of Helmand saw it as a security risk to attend that hospital, for fear of either the hospital being targeted while they were inside it, or for fear of retribution when they went back to their clinics and were questioned about why they had attended a politically compromised health facility. So with MSF's arrival back in Afghanistan, we've taken the politics out of Goodh Hospital. It is now a gun-free zone, and it's full of patients from all over Helmand province. And that brings me on to my final issue to throw into discussion, which very much harks back to the Somalia presentation. When we hear about the consequences of stabilisation, blurring of the lines, militarisation of aid, it's so often about us as NGOs, about a loss of humanitarian space, about aid workers being killed and kidnapped. But what about the people that are stuck in the middle of these conflict situations? in Helmand too scared to seek healthcare in a politically compromised health facility, or most likely, in fact, unable to reach healthcare at all due to the loss of access to vast tracts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia. So through the politicization of development and humanitarian activities, what have we lost? As we heard in Somalia, it has been at great cost to the mission. But that mission is fundamentally not about securing the image and reputation of NGOs. That is essentially just a tool. It is about people. And I believe that the greatest loss with the stabilisation agenda has been that access and the lives of ordinary people.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank all of our panellists for some really excellent and stimulating presentations. We have just over half an hour for some questions and comments, so I'd like to ask those of you who would like to speak, I'd ask you to try and keep your comments as brief as possible, please, and please forgive me if I cut you off for the interest of bringing as many people in as possible. But I think that that's only fair because we have run over, inevitably with a large panel like this, we've run over time. Can I also ask that you say who you are before you speak? I'm going to start over at this side over here. James has a question. You can introduce yourself too.
Hello. Is it on? Yeah. James Darcy from ODI. Thank you all. That was excellent and fascinating, and I think it's a really good issue of disasters. It sheds a lot of light on the subject, and it debunks quite a lot of myths that needed to be debunked, I would suggest. The particular thing I wanted to ask about, I wanted to go back to Ken Menkhaus's presentation, which I thought was excellent, and I thought he gave us a very clear framework for discussing this topic. He set out the idea of these competing narratives, these competing agendas. He named three in particular: the humanitarian, the state building, and the security counterinsurgency. There are others, of course, but just taking those three. I think you're absolutely right in saying we need to acknowledge there are trade-offs and then think about how we go about addressing the trade-offs. Let's not be lulled into this idea that somehow through 3 Cs and 3 Ds we can make all of these agendas complementary. My question or my comment is about the nature of the trade-offs. I suspect that the humanitarians have been lulled into wanting to have wider relevance on the political agenda and therefore being lulled into accepting their part in this wider political agenda. And by the way, money comes with that. They've also been too slow to address the point that Ken made, which is that often, although indeed the impact of their intervention on that context is not neutral politically, it is rarely decisive in a negative sense in advancing the political interests of one party or another. And I think that the humanitarians have actually been too slow to make that argument. My final point is this, and it's about protection of civilians. On the security side, we've seen in Afghanistan how when the security agenda, the counterinsurgency agenda, appeared to fail, the language adopted was actually that of humanitarianism. It became a protection of civilians agenda. And it seemed to me the humanitarians kind of didn't object enough to that re-description of the agenda, because actually I don't think it is a protection of civilian agenda. It was an agenda about the use of force, when actually, from a humanitarian point of view, this is about restraint in the use of force. This is about applying the Geneva Conventions, about not killing civilians in the way you conduct your activities. So I think in various ways, the humanitarians have been too slow to challenge the adoption of certain sorts of language in these contexts.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question here.
Clearly, the humanitarian organisations are increasingly under threat because of the politicisation of the area. I wondered to the extent that we should actually be seeking to amend international humanitarian law in order to actually give protection, certainly to those organisations that can be shown to be purely humanitarian. And that, of course, is particularly the medical ones who can be seen to be providing life-saving care. It could be argued that it's unlikely to be, any amended law is unlikely to be, as it were, adhered to, But I think we're actually seeing a change in the international environment with the International Court, albeit not universally accepted, starting to have an impact. And you actually have precedent as to how humanitarian law was evolved to actually cover military medical services at a time when it was not accepted that they should actually have any neutrality. So I just wonder the extent to which we should be pressing, particularly the International Committee of the Red Cross, to actually start seeking to amend international law.
Thanks. I think I'm just going to jump over to that side of the room and then come back in, if that's okay. We've got a few hands up over there.
My name's Chidi Wano. I just have a question in two parts. The first is in reference to stabilization ops in general, in that it seems that the success stories, or the majority of the success stories, have a common factor in that there's the unity of efforts, that everything is unified under one kind of command, be it the military and the development side of things. So is there an argument then for unilateral action in those contexts? So places like Somalia, for example, would there be an argument for possibly taking away the peacekeeping side of things from the AU force to a more unilateral force, with one clear political objective and one clear chain of command, and obviously in other areas as well? And the second question relates to preemptive stabilization operations. So we've got many countries that are, in the type of in a fragile state. All those key determinants of a fragile state, be it losing control of their borders, etc., are coming into play. Places like Nigeria and Kyrgyzstan and things like that. Is there an element, within the development community or within the within NGOs for a lot of preemptive action, in terms of, rather than waiting for those countries to fail, actually building up, working with the stronger nations, the greater powers, to put a lot of pressure on those countries and prevent them from failing?
Thank you. If we could pass the mic around the people who want to speak over there.
Hi, Paul Harvey in Humanitarian Outcomes. I wanted to pick up on what Ken was talking about, and I guess it's a question for maybe Ken or Vickie. And Ken was talking about the sort of political will for humanitarianism and needing to make the case. And I wonder if there's an issue in Somalia and other places, it's what I think of the crying wolf problem, that to the lay observer at least, the way they've made the argument is if you don't provide aid, millions of people will die, and they haven't. So whilst not minimizing the sort of suffering that is taking place and has taken place in Somalia, there is a problem in the way that humanitarians are communicating the consequences of aid not reaching people, and over time a crying wolf problem building up. And linked to that, I guess, an issue with the suffering that is taking place being hidden because of the lack of access. And so it's the point Vickie was making in Afghanistan, and the same problem in Somalia, that once access becomes so restricted that the suffering becomes hidden, it becomes even harder to make the case.
Thank you. We'll take one more, and then I'm going to take a round of responsives, if that's okay.
I just wonder whether it's Nick Stockton. I just wonder whether it's worth also asking the question: have the majority of organisations who wish to kind of operate under the label of humanitarian, in fact, probably forfeited the right to do so, in the way that they have indeed engaged in very explicitly political activities in many other aspects of their mandates, and as a consequence, in effect, have polluted humanitarian space to the extent that it has become dangerous for organisations like MSF. And I'd be interested to know, Vickie, what your views inside MSF are with regard to, if you like, the very liberal use of the word humanitarian, and how much that might apply, for example, or not apply, particularly to the major UN agencies involved in so-called humanitarian work, and indeed probably the big NGOs as well.
Thank you. Vickie, there were a few questions that were specifically directed, not surprisingly, to you. I wonder if you'd be happy to start with a few responses to those that were most directly relevant to your comments and to MSF.
Okay. So just to pick up on a few of them, James, I couldn't, yes, I would have to agree that as humanitarian actors that we have been slow to make the argument that came out in the Somalia one about the decisiveness of humanitarian aid in this conflict. And and to turn the spotlight back on the donors, in fact, and to highlight their role in terms of the fueling the conflict debate. And I came across a fantastic parallel the other day of a WFP representative in the 80s talking about diversion from the camps in Pakistan, and how if the donors didn't ask questions, then WFP looked the other way. And in Somalia today, of course, we see the donors asking very searching questions, because in Pakistan in the 80s, quite frankly, it suited their objectives that that aid was diverted, and in Somalia it doesn't. So, yeah, so it's kind of, the thrust of it is basically, yeah, we should be turning the spotlight back on that activity, I think. And then should we amend IHL? I'm not an IHL expert. I don't know if there's anybody in the room who is, but as far as we're concerned, actually, the protection of the medical service does exist in IHL as it stands. And so the problem is not necessarily IHL itself, but the lack of its application to places that we deem to be conflict areas, like Afghanistan. It has taken the British government a very long time to recognise that there is active conflict in Afghanistan. For years, until probably only about 2009, they have been calling Helmand a post-conflict setting. So, yeah, for me, it's not so much amending it; it's applying it and recognising recognizing that it is a legitimate framework for these conflict settings that we find today. For the crying wolf problem, I mean, I also don't want to. I can't talk for the humanitarian sector NGO community as a whole. And yeah, I think from MSF's perspective, we really try, and we try very hard. In fact, when we talk about what we see. We talk about on the basis of the patients that are presenting in front of us. So in Helmand, it's been very difficult to extrapolate from those patients in front of us as to what might be going on in the rest of Helmand province. So for the crying wolf problem, I don't think MSF is the worst for that, but we perhaps find it difficult, therefore, to really draw attention to the situation because of this necessity for it always to be on the basis of our field work rather than extrapolation. And then, Nick, your question on MSF's perspective on the liberal application of the word humanitarian. I mean, so that's what I was really getting at the end when I was saying organisations have to make choices. And there is nothing wrong with supporting a long-term objective in Afghanistan that may, it's questionable, but it may come out with better development outcomes. There's a perfectly legitimate choice. But you cannot combine that with also professing to be a humanitarian and to be delivering humanitarian assistance that by its very nature must be independent, impartial and neutral, or else it is not humanitarian. So I just come back to what I said in my presentation about it is making the choice and clearly and transparently articulating it.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Ken here. I don't know if you heard, Ken. There was a question about.
I think you can.
Oh, sorry. Can you? Sorry, I've made a mistake. I've pressed the button the wrong way. Sorry. Now you can hear me. I'll start again. There was a question that was directed to you, Ken, around unified action in Somalia. So I wondered if you have any comments on that before I open the floor and ask if any of the other panel want to speak.
The question of unified action in Somalia has been a long-running debate. This is nothing new. We had this back in the UN operation in Somalia, 1993-94. Very vigorous efforts to create unified action there. The Department of Humanitarian Affairs tried to coordinate all of that, all under an SRSG. And what we've learned is that doesn't actually work in practice. It's the different UN specialized agencies have their own agendas. Different military units in peacekeeping operations have their own command and control and will do their own thing. The NGOs are highly autonomous. Even within donor governments, you've got huge debates within different departments or ministries. So I think the call for more coordination is generally the way every meeting always ends. And it rarely seems to have much of an impact. I mean, I've reached a point where, for me, the problem of command and control, more unified action is just a problem. It's a point of departure. It's a given that we're going to have problems with that rather than a problem to be solved. I had a couple of other thoughts, if I could, on a few of the other comments. Is that okay?
Yes, yes. Yes, it is, of course. Go ahead.
Okay, great. James's point about the NGOs being lulled and being slow to make their case, I think is really important. In Somalia, we've seen an interesting pattern. In the early 90s, the international NGOs had an unbelievably dominant voice. They framed the discourse. They drove discussions. They had almost a monopoly on media access, the moral high ground, you name it. And then, I mean, almost to a fault. I think it was too much back then. But then, starting in the mid-1990s, what we saw in Somalia is many of the more robust, outspoken nonprofits and humanitarian aid agencies left for one reason or another. And many who replaced them really were little more than subcontractors for the European Union. Very, very quiescent, very apolitical, and dependent for most of their funding on the major donor states. We're starting to see that change again. The nonprofits, the humanitarian actors in Somalia are starting to find their voice again. But I have to say, I have been stunned and surprised at how weak the response has been to the systematic attacks on basic humanitarian principles, coming from sometimes the highest levels. The UN Special Representative of the Secretary General was essentially claiming in publications that humanitarian neutrality can be complicit, and there was really quite a weak response to that. And I am. Part of it, I think, is that there are just not many operating in Somalia anymore. Part of it is financial dependency on some of the major donors. If I could say a final point about the crying wolf problem quickly, that has been a problem in Somalia. There is no question that humanitarian actors at different points in time have exaggerated the scope of humanitarian crises in order to win funding. It's impossible to deny that. Having said that, when you look at the lay of the land in Somalia, the unbelievable levels of underdevelopment, malnutrition, infant mortality, displacement, refugees, I mean, we have developed a pretty impressive threshold for other people's pain in Somalia. And I think in some ways you could also make the case that we failed to adequately ring the alarm bell on what's become the normalization of humanitarian crises in a country that anywhere else this would be a loud humanitarian emergency. We've come to accept that and applaud the Somalis for their extraordinary coping mechanisms, which are really extraordinary, but which certainly have run the risk, I think, of being exhausted. A final point on that, and that is when it comes to crying wolf and the general humanitarian assessments, I would say one thing we haven't touched on this morning, I don't think, I had to step out for a minute, maybe you did touch on it then, but the humanitarian actors in Somalia, at any rate, make a real clear distinction between those who, the very small number of them, who are dealing with large food aid shipments versus all the rest that are dealing with health and other smaller scale interventions. The latter really try to keep their distance from WFP and CARE and others who were dealing with these very large quantities of food shipments. They make the case that they can work in some of these areas and protect a certain amount of humanitarian space from armed groups in a way that the people dealing with multi-million-dollar shipments of food aid cannot.
Thank you very much, Ken. I was just in listening to you and to the other comments, and Vickie's included. I was reminded of the subtitle that we used in our introduction, one of the subtitles that we used in our introductory article to the special issue. Our 3 Cs were complex, contradictory, and competitive. And I think that our feeling is that describes the program and policy landscape perhaps more accurately in reality than the coherence and coordination and so on. And under that observation is the one that really the reason that coordination and effective coordination has proved so difficult and unrealized and so difficult to realize is that it isn't simply a sort of technical matter. And I think there's often in the approach to whole of government approaches and strengthening them the sense that if only we can just get our act together a bit better. But of course there are deep sort of political and other reasons why coordination is so difficult. And the sort of follow-up point to that is that the competition, contradiction and complexity applies as much to the humanitarian sector as it does to the stabilisation landscape more generally. And I think that the problem that probably plays out in different ways, and I don't know if Ken would agree, but in Somalia, the extent to which different organisations are chasing funds with certain conditions attached, chasing access with certain conditions attached, does actually undermine the sort of principled and coherent sort of stand and approach of humanitarian agencies. I want to ask our other two panellists if they have any particular comments on the questions that have been raised so far.
I just wanted to make one point, and that's with regards to the one actor and one objective. And I think that what's clear within stabilisation is that conventional wisdom is that even if you try to seek kind of narrow security objectives, that they require also a transformational type of outcomes as well. And I think therefore the complexity arises in the kind of tensions that arise between those different agendas as opposed to one actor having one specific objective.
Jonathan? No? Okay. We've got a couple of questions along the front here, so I'll start over.
Hi, I'm Marion Pécher. I'm doing a PhD at SOAS on principal humanitarianism, maybe. I've got a question for Jonathan, because you mentioned as a conclusion, you finished by saying that some NGOs had very pragmatic approach in Sri Lanka and acute knowledge of the context, and that might then, I don't know, maybe I have misunderstood that, but they might reconcile then the situation, the politicized situation therein, and humanitarian approaches. I'm quite curious about that.
I'd also like to read out a question that's come in for Jonathan before we pass the mic along. Another question for you, Jonathan. You mentioned the primacy of, this is from Robert Barclay, who's a graduate student from SOAS here in the University of London. You've mentioned the primacy of domestic politics in stabilisation efforts and briefly touched on the role of local civil society in complex humanitarian emergencies. I wonder if the panellists could discuss the implications of INGOs partnering with local NGOs in situations in humanitarian actions in stabilisation contexts. Does this lead to greater or worse coherence in humanitarian action or stabilisation efforts? So that's the second question in this round, and we'll come to the front row here.
Hi, my name is Paul Reynolds. I work broadly in some state building and conflict, various other types of things. And I liked very much, Sarah, your diagram where you showed the different sort of groups of actors and with their groups of objectives and so on. But of course the differences, the distinctions between the different actors and sets of objectives, of course, are not hard and fast. Of course, there's but perhaps they're more hard and fast than they need to be, particularly between humanitarian development and state building and development. I think one of the reasons for that, from my experience, Afghanistan, Iraq, East Timor, different places, it is that from the state building side, quite often there's no real coherent plan as to how they're going to build the state. If state building is what they're trying to do. It's certainly true. I mean, the most extreme example would be perhaps Afghanistan and Iraq, where in Afghanistan, if you ask the people involved, even DFID, well, how are you, your state, but how are you going to build the state, and you don't get a coherent answer. Most of the development spending is either sort of, going along with the centralisation of the state, or it's extra-constitutional. So much of the spending is extra-constitutional. So how can you build the state if your spending is extra-constitutional? I think that there's a gap in how state building is done. And my long-term conclusion is that the humanitarian side should get better at filling the gap and developing models and ways of developing the state from their humanitarian experience.
Thank you. If I could ask you to pass the mic straight over, and if I could ask you to keep your comment very short, because we've only got a few minutes left and we've still got a few hands up.
Yeah, Sri Lankan Tamils can't thank MSF enough for the extremely difficult conditions they are working, restrictions they are working. And now a question to ODI and Jonathan and all the research institutes in Britain and all over the world. One of the factors is any conflict is created by the politicians, leaders, and the people in one country, and there are international actors that impinge on the conflict. There is so much of research on in conflict insensitive interaction by the foreign parts on the exacerbating conflicts. And last week in Sri Lanka, the elders, International Commission of Juries, AI, HRW, they have all been making recommendations to the international community to ask the Sri Lankan, to press the Sri Lankan to do something, but they, without, in spite of all that, last week a group of 9 parliamentarians, British parliamentarians, have gone there without giving any explanation why they are not accepting the recommendations of the international organizations, and going there in spite of all that, and with the agenda that has nothing to do, that is not at all connected with the ground conditions, which is still in the last 16 months after the war was over, Tamils are still under oppression, aid agents are severely restricted from reaching the starving people, and it is the place is highly diluted, flooded with drugs by the army. It's so much of injustice there, but still the British parliamentarians have gone there without questioning the government. So all the research institutes which have been doing 3-4 decades of research, what do you say to those British parliamentarians, please?
Let's pass on. I'm going to give this 3, if you try and keep your questions very short, please, so that we can get the remaining questions in and have a few minutes for answers.
Hi there. I'd like to ask the panel, but especially Professor Menkhaus and Dr. Goodh about their view about the relative successes of externally imposed and internally created stabilisation processes. Because a lot of the time it seems to me that the international intervention seems to promote Western motives, interests and values, which delegitimises the central sort of state that's been created or the process itself.
Thank you. Just a couple more over there, and then I'm going to pass back to the panel.
Ruth Jacobson of the University of Bristol. I had a longer one about the phenomenon of disappearing women historically, but I'll skip that one. But so it's a specific question. Given the fact that gender in the widest sense can be an aspect of all the pretty ovals that we saw on the screens, and that it is now possibly an element in terms of the debate that my colleague just mentioned about imposition of modernity and Western values. In the course of your case studies, have you come across any evidence that humanitarian agencies and peace-building agencies are engaging really seriously with issues of gender and political settlement and long-term stabilization? And if not, perhaps you'd like to make a comment on that.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, from your point of view, who is driving this stabilization agenda exactly? And to what extent is it a genuine expression of internationalism, an international response to these fragile states and humanitarian crises? Or is it really just the policy of a few strong world powers?
Thanks. I think we'll take one more question and then I'm going to pass back to the panel.
Thanks. Mike Lewis from Oxfam. I represent one of those agencies who I suspect some would think has forfeited the right to sit within the humanitarian space to some degree. I wouldn't agree with that, but I think that's sometimes the perception. and I've been very struck by the way in which two things have been conflated in some of the discourse around stabilisation. One about political objectives and the other about donors' national security objectives. And from our perspective, sometimes obviously they look the same and sometimes they look quite different. So, you know, in the instance of Afghanistan, in Helmand, when you know, agricultural development is focused in places where counter-narcotics programs are, rather than more broadly, that looks like national security interests. It doesn't look like the kind of politically transformative interventions that agencies like Oxfam might be involved in. So I wondered whether panelists thought that there was a kind of cigarette paper that was possible to put between political objectives and donors' national security objectives, or whether people think that's a kind of false distinction.
Okay. I think I just had a very quick response, sort of partial response to a couple of those questions before I pass over to the other panelists. When we were discussing some of these issues in the course of preparing this paper, and we were asking what is stabilisation, how do you define it? I mean, what seemed to pull things together in a helpful way for us was to think of stabilisation as the pursuit of a particular political order, but that might be highly variable, obviously, across lots of different contexts. And importantly, the political order that's being pursued by the most powerful actors involved in that situation. And so, therefore, to some extent, in some situations, that might very closely reflect the national security objectives of donor governments, but in other cases less so, where they don't have so much power, and Sri Lanka would be one of those examples. And another insight that leads from that is that stabilisation, as is reflected in our historical article in the special issue, is nothing new in a sense. The label might be quite new in the way it's being used, but it isn't a new agenda. But perhaps what is perhaps particularly novel in the here and now is the extent to which it has become tied, at least rhetorically, with a liberal peace-building agenda. And that then entangles all the principles and objectives of a whole range of NGOs who have been working for the liberal peace-building agenda to a greater or lesser extent. So that complicates matters as well. I'm now going to ask Ken to respond to any questions, then Jonathan, then Samir, and then Vickie.
You all are starting to break up for me. Can you hear me?
No, we need your I think we're just turning up the volume. We should be able to hear you now.
Can you hear me? Because you're breaking up on my side. I'm having trouble seeing and hearing you.
We can hear you at the moment.
Okay, I'll go ahead then. Just signal me. Give me a hand signal if I break up. The first question that I wanted to respond to had to do with external versus internal stabilization. And the question really gets to the heart of a very important matter, and that is in all of these failed and failing states and zones of conflict, stabilization efforts often presume that local populations are passive passive victims in the face of state failure and armed conflict, and they are decidedly not. They are very active agents in building local systems of governance, drawing on a combination of customary law, religious law, hybrid relationships between women's groups and business community leaders and others. And it's often very impressive, but it's largely invisible to most of us. Not so much the humanitarian aid agencies. They've got pretty good eyes at recognizing fellow non-state actors. But they're invisible to the state builders. And they're indigestible in some ways to the state builders, because these hybrid polities, these zones that some of us have been calling governance without government, often defy formal government. They resist it, and they're seen as a problem rather than a solution. And this is yet another example of the tension between humanitarian and state building and security agendas. Two of the three, the security folks and the humanitarian folks, can plug in pretty nicely to these local systems of governance, but the state builders really can't, and often find them a threat. If I could say just a quick word about the framing issue of this entire debate. One of the things that struck me as I've listened to our conversation it is how this tension has been framed in the international community, and how it's not been framed. In fact, it has not been very effectively framed as a matter of competing principles. That argument's out there, but it's currently a weak argument. It's not even been framed so much by utilitarian discourse. That is to say, okay, we've got competing objectives, we need to prioritize, we need to talk about sequencing. That's out there, but that's not really what's dictating terms either, at least in Somalia. In Somalia, the way that the matter has been framed now is as three competing legal discourses. You've got on the one hand, humanitarian actors invoking international humanitarian law. You've got the state builders invoking rule of law and constitutions and sovereignty. And then you've got the security dimension of this invoking, in the case of the US, the Patriot Act or other counterterrorism laws in other countries. And the problem with this framing is that only one of those three laws is enforceable, and it's the latter. And it's enforceable with fairly significant penalties for someone who violates those laws. As long as the legal discourse really ends up dominating the discussion about how to reconcile these different agendas, we're not going to get very far. And I can tell you that there are efforts within the US government to try to disentangle this, but it has so far, the legal dimension has trumped all other considerations. I hope you can hear me, because you all are completely breaking up on the video now.
Thank you very much, Ken. I think I'm going to give 1 minute to everyone else before we close. We've just got a few minutes before we need to close the meeting. Jonathan.
1 minute, okay. I suppose one issue is, firstly, I mean, who are the humanitarians? We've been talking a lot about kind of, in many ways, a formal humanitarian sector. But if you look at places like Sri Lanka, it's far more complex than this. And the government, while it's also one of the main perpetrators of abuses, it's also the main provider of humanitarian assistance. It's the main source of entitlements to the population in the north and east of the country, and it was throughout the war. It's one of the paradoxes of the country. The diaspora community, hometown associations, these informal forms of humanitarianism are often far more important than the formal humanitarian sector. Second, that leads me to the second point, which is about kind of local organisations, NGOs, and also less formal organisations, church-based groups, for instance, have been very, very important and are still working in these, in the north and the east, and with some kind of principles as well. I mean, they're providing entitlements. So I think, I could talk about that more, but I haven't got time. The last thing is about this kind of internal versus external, and there's an assumption here that stabilisation is an internal problem of an external solution, and yet what we're seeing in all these cases is about the very destabilising effects of stabilisation that's externally promoted. So I think the Sri Lankan case, there's a danger that we look at that as though there is a kind of the liberal version of peace building which didn't quite work, and then this very illiberal domestic version of peace building. But during the height of the peace process, there was a lot of human rights abuses going on, and there was a kind of a means-ends calculation. Okay, well, we need to prioritise the peace process, and so we deprioritise protection and human rights issues. So I think there needs to be much more critical here about external actors in terms of stabilisation, and look much more carefully, as I said at the beginning, at domestic politics and how political order or disorder emerges in those contexts.
Thank you. Samir.
Okay, just on 2 points. On the issue with regards to local actors, I think in terms of whether working with local actors generates more coherence for humanitarians, I think that that's problematic in the sense that most situations of working with local actors in stabilisation context is often through remote programming. So the actual contact with the local organisation is often at a kind of a relationship that's not ideal. But furthermore, for example, in contexts like Pakistan, a lot of the organisations that do work with international humanitarian organisations are not actually purely humanitarian in terms of their background, but often them come, for example, from a counter-radicalization programs or background, and they've taken the opportunity to kind of involve themselves in humanitarian assistance because the opportunities are there. So I think in terms of generating coherence, I don't think working with local actors necessarily creates that. And just one last thing on the terms of who's driving the stabilization agenda and whether it's some kind of international agenda. I mean, I think that there is no one stabilization agenda. I mean, Sarah was talking before how it takes different forms in different places and often governed by different rules and objectives. And I think that what has become quite pervasive, I think, is this idea that you need to work more coherently, you need to work in integrated fashion. So you see that in places such as Colombia adopting that discourses, you see that in Afghanistan, you see that through the UN. But then I think ultimately what differs is the objectives that that integration is seeking to achieve. And I think that that definitely differs between how stabilization plays out in different contexts.
Thank you. Vickie, give the last word.
Always nice. So just to pick up on 3 specific questions, to add to what Samir said about the partnering with local organisations question, I think from MSF's perspective, I would just take it back to that point I made in my presentation about thinking about how the decisions you make locally impact your image globally. So if in one place you say, we don't take that kind of approach, we work completely independently, yet in another place you are taking that approach, that can have ramifications. Then to pick up on the question about the humanitarian side, if I understood you correctly, the humanitarian side needs to get better at plugging the gap before the state building processes can kick in. I think we didn't have the presentation about Haiti, but I think Haiti is an interesting example of where MSF at the moment is caught in a little bit of a, we are going through a reflection process about where we draw the line in terms of getting drawn into the reconstruction process. We are providing a large amount of the secondary healthcare that is available in Haiti at the moment. But at the same time, we're not reconstruction experts. We don't know how to go about rebuilding a healthcare system. So for us, it is very important in order to preserve as well our identity as a humanitarian actor, that we don't get too far drawn into that process. And so at the moment, we're very much asking ourselves the questions, well, how do we not? And I think for us, the kind of answer that we're perhaps coming to is that whilst we will not be advising on the reconstruction of a healthcare system in Haiti, we may be able to add to the reflection in terms of really making sure that the needs are being accurately reflected in the system. So we are seeing patients come through our wards, and therefore we can have input in that way, really, through the use of our data, in effect. And then finally, just to respond to Oxfam, for us, I'm afraid the important distinction is not the one necessarily between political and security objectives. I can understand from Oxfam's perspective that is very important, but from the perspective of MSF, the important distinction actually is between humanitarian and development, because development can quite justifiably sometimes be linked to political objectives, that's clear. Let's not go to the national security bit, but so for us, that's the important distinction to make.
Thank you very much. I should have mentioned at the beginning that in addition to the 3-month free trial from Wiley and Blackwell, they've also made 2 articles from the special issue free online. That's right, isn't it? It's the introductory article that Samir, myself, and Robert Mugger wrote, and Ken's article on Somalia is the second. So those are available free online. The main thing I need to do is to thank our panel very much for really excellent meeting today, for their presentations, and also all of you for some excellent questions. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much indeed. And